Zack Snyder. There's a good chance if you've been on the internet for a few years, hearing that name either gets you excited to discuss his work, or strikes fear in your heart of what his fans might do to you. While Zack Snyder was certainly a respected filmmaker before the release of Justice League, I feel like it's fair to say the release of Justice League in 2017 and the hashtag Release the Snyder Cut movement that followed did a lot in getting Snyder's name out there and into the general consciousness. As of the time of writing this script, Snyder's most recent directed movie, Rebel Moon, is set to release on December 22nd, 2023 on Netflix. The film was originally pitched as a Star Wars project and still carries many elements reminiscent of Star Wars in the final product. As a Star Wars fan, naturally I was curious to see how Snyder would tackle a similar concept in his own unique directorial style. But wait, what even is Zack Snyder's style? Truth be told, before starting this marathon, I've only seen 3 of Zack Snyder's directed films. I'll mention which ones when I get to them. Really, I don't know anything about what a movie that is directed by Zack Snyder is supposed to look like. So naturally, I did what any normal person would do and decided to watch every movie that Zack Snyder has directed. A few things to get out of the way before we start. I'm only discussing the films that Snyder has directed, so no movies like Suicide Squad, Wonder Woman, or Army of Thieves where Snyder only has producer credits. I very nearly considered including 300 Rise of the Empire, since Snyder has writing and producer credits for the film, but I decided against it. I also will be taking a look at both versions of Justice League, since Snyder has directorial credits on both films, and they are different enough to where they are basically 2 different movies and warrant separate discussions. So without any further ado, join me as I take a journey that I will probably ultimately regret. Spoilers for basically all of these movies, by the way.
Oh my god! What's wrong with your face?
We begin with Snyder's directorial debut, 2004's Dawn of the Dead, a remake of the 1978 classic of the same name. I've never actually seen the original film or its predecessor, Night of the Living Dead, so because I didn't have enough work for myself already, I watched both of those as well, and here are my brief thoughts. 1968's Night of the Living Dead, directed by George Romero, is a stone-cold classic. While I personally didn't find the movie that scary, it was absolutely gripping from start to finish. A truly harrowing depiction of being stuck in a house during a zombie apocalypse. It's kind of crazy to me how smart the zombies in this movie are, using weapons to break windows and even the headlights on cars. That's not something you really see anymore. Also, no one actually says the word zombie in this movie, which I thought was pretty funny. 1978's Dawn of the Dead may be even better than the original, but it is very much a different experience. Night of the Living Dead was claustrophobic and stressful and had a looming sense of dread hanging over the entire movie. Dawn of the Dead manages to balance that tone with a genuine warmth that comes from how much fun the main characters are having dicking around in a mall. You can't help but laugh along with them. Everyone is likable, and it makes the sudden moments where the movie gets serious and the characters are in real danger all the more nail-biting, and the tragic moments all the more heartbreaking. Combined with the movie's criticism of consumerism and our over-reliance on it, Dawn of the Dead cements itself as a triumph of the horror genre, and a must-watch for those who can get their hands on it. I was honestly stunned by both of these movies. I usually don't like to go into things with too high expectations. I don't like getting disappointed, and I also just feared these movies could never live up to their reputation. I was so happy to be proven wrong, and I'm now horrified to see how a remake of Dawn of the Dead might go. 2004's Dawn of the Dead is a remake in name only. Similar to the Evil Dead remake, it takes the same basic premise from the original, but throws a new cast of characters into the mix. They fill similar archetypes to the original cast, but they are their own distinct characters with their own reactions and thoughts on the events they're experiencing. What immediately struck me about this movie is how it's much more overtly scary. In the original Dawn of the Dead, the horror came from seeing the characters in stressful situations, and while that's still the case, they're much more overtly suspenseful, with long silent pauses followed by loud noises or shocking events. I feel like it's very easy to get jump scares wrong, but for the most part, I think this movie handles it well. It captures the terror of the setting pretty well. Like, yeah, if I was here, I would be pretty scared if a gun suddenly rang out in dead silence or a zombie suddenly burst through the door. It does get old fast, though. The fear is also bolstered by the fact the zombies are much more outwardly aggressive in this film. Rather than the slow-moving and groaning husk of the original, they're violent, screeching animals that are desperate to get their hands on flesh. They're also no longer blue and much more noticeably decayed and torn apart, which helps. What I also notice is how this world is painted much more by shades of gray rather than black and white. This movie doesn't open with a bigot SWAT agent murdering people for the fun of, and the government forcing people out of their homes. It opens with Anna driving away from the chaos and fear, leaving people behind to save herself, getting her car nearly stolen because this person didn't want to die. Hell, one of this film's central characters, Andre, is a criminal who only does what he does to support his loved ones. On a religious angle, the remake seems to frame the apocalypse as a punishment for humanity, as opposed to the original, where it's almost an unfortunate consequence. In the original, no more room in hell just means the dead have to go somewhere. In the remake, the dead have come to cleanse the world of the sinners. The movie literally opens with a mushroom cloud from an explosion transitioning to a human skull, as if to say, we are the architects of our own destruction. The movie takes place at the Crossroads Mall. Spiritually, Crossroads are often depicted as a sort of limbo that acts as a transition to and a way to contact the spiritual realm. In a way, while these characters remain here, they're neither alive nor dead, as far as the rest of the world is concerned. The only contact with the outside world they have is Andy across the street. Inside the mall is the Hallowed Grounds Cafe, implying it to be a sort of holy sanctuary for the last bastion of humanity prepared to fight the armies of Babylon. None of what I have said so far is to complain or even praise the film, it's just interesting stuff I noticed. So let's actually talk about complaints I have with this film. One issue that immediately stuck out to me with this movie is the characters, or rather, the amount of them. In the original, we only had 4 to keep track of and attach to. But here, there's over a dozen of them, which means there's nowhere near enough screen time for all of them to feel developed and for me to attach to all of them. It's especially noticeable when Nicole's father is killed early on, when it's revealed he's been bitten. It's supposed to be a big, emotional, and sad moment, and, well, yeah, it's sad. I've only just met these characters, so the moment isn't as strong. There's also CJ, who spends the first half of this movie with a similar role to Henry from the original Night of the Living Dead, constantly trying to maintain control of the group to fuel his own ego. But once CJ is released from his cell in the second half of the movie, he seems to just suddenly be an ally, even making a sacrifice play to save everyone at the end. Why? I'm not sure. He reads a magazine with a relationship advice, and one of the things it mentions is trust, and that's basically all the character development he gets. Many of the other characters don't fare much better, especially the nothing romance between Anna and Michael. Because of the lack of focus on many of the characters, we also lose the sense of camaraderie that grows between them that the original handled so well. All of that development ends up getting condensed into a single montage, the only montage of the characters having fun in the mall in the entire movie. The movie also completely ditches the consumerist themes of the original. The dead don't walk the halls of the mall like customers anymore, and the main cast doesn't get tired of their endless supply and long for escape anymore. The mall just ends up becoming elaborate set dressing. The only reason any of them think about leaving is when the birth of Andre's child leads to 3 deaths in the group. 4 if you count the baby, I guess. I mean, I don't. Honestly, Dawn of the Dead remake isn't bad. It's just nothing amazing or anything. It's definitely a fun horror romp that'll get a few good scares, but there's nothing much more to it in that. I enjoyed my time with it for what it was though, and I wouldn't mind seeing it again. Also, I don't know where else to mention this, but the ending not being open-ended like the original movie was really deflating, but it gets bonus points for the dog. Okay, moving on.
This is madness! Madness. This is Sparta!
300 is a 5-issue comic book miniseries from 1998, Written and illustrated by Frank Miller, the comic is a fictionalized retelling of the Battle of Thermopylae? Is that it? Okay, let's see here. How to pronounce Thermopylae. What the fuck? Thermopylae. Okay, apparently it's Thermopylae. So there you go. 300 is a fictionalized retelling of the Battle of Thermopylae. Honestly, I never realized there was a comic that the movie was based on. Since it's only 5 issues, I figured I would give it a quick read through for fun. The comic definitely presents a clear bias towards the Spartans, often holding them up as an example for every other Greek to follow. And the Persians, especially, are straight up bad guys, no question about it. For the sake of a fictionalized narrative, I was able to look past it, but I imagine actual history experts might take issue with that. As someone who retained basically nothing from any of my world history classes, however, I thought the book was pretty cool. The art is what elevates 300 from a simple retelling to spectacle, really selling the grand scale of the battle and making every environment feel larger than life. The book accomplishes this by making every part of the comic a 2-page spread, which really helps give the comic its own visual identity and allow the art more room to breathe. Lynn Varley's coloring work also really helps breathe life into the comic and make it easier to parse out the finer details. Though it's not perfect and probably not all that historically accurate, I still think 300 is worth a read if you're at all interested in this time period. Though now I am a little worried at how the pacing of this relatively short comic could be ruined by stretching it into film length. First thing, the comic is better for not having this movie's unnecessary sex scene. I really appreciate how the color grading goes out of its way to match the original 300 comic. Some shots of this movie are absolutely stunning, some attempt to replicate panels from the comic, and some are, well, pretty ugly looking to be honest. Because of the film's look, it makes the CG and green screen stand out way more than they may have otherwise. Ephialtes looks pretty good though, since he's mostly a practical effect I believe. The depiction of the Persians is somehow worse in this. The messenger brings the skulls of kings to Sparta, and the immortals seem to be more monster than man. The added scenes don't destroy the pacing of the film, but the original comic's briefer nature definitely worked in its favor. You could probably shave 20 minutes off this movie and it wouldn't suffer much. The movie attempts to add more depth to figures like Adamas and Stelios, I'm not even gonna try to pronounce these correctly, but no one has enough screen time to be super compelling besides maybe Gorgo. The movie even de-emphasizes the role of Dilios, despite him still being the narrator. Honestly, I don't have much else to say about this movie. It often pulls dialogue verbatim from the original comic and for the most part does it all justice. I would still rather recommend the comic just for the art and the short but sweet nature of it all, but this isn't a bad alternative. It captures the spirit and the spectacle of the original comic quite well, but your enjoyment may vary when it comes to the film's premise and how it depicts history. Honestly, the only thing that would have pushed me to watch this movie if I wasn't doing this video is the meme.
It's so sad Steve Jobs died of ligma.
Who the hell is Steve Jobs?
Ligma balls.
Ever since the original Watchmen comic concluded in 1987, there have been several attempts at getting a film adaptation off the ground, before ultimately, a Watchmen film directed by Zack Snyder was released in 2009, following the success of 300. I have actually seen and read both this film and the original comic before making this video, but I never actually finished either of them. Watchmen has fascinated me for years, and I wanted to finally cross the comic off my bucket list before I jumped into this movie. Side note, this will probably be the last aside I do because I'm already getting fucking tired of this. So, when I started writing this part of the video, I just sort of sat here for a while. Watchmen is a difficult book to talk about since it feels like everything that has been said about it has already been said. It's one of the most critically acclaimed books of all time, and there's a non-zero chance one of you watching has already read it before. Watchmen is a book where any lessons or meaning you take from it are largely determined by your personal opinions and perspectives. And that's all I have to offer you, my perspective. I think the most common takeaway from Watchmen you see is the idea that superheroes would just be inherently terrible people if they existed in our reality. While I do think that reading is valid, I personally think Watchmen is more nuanced than that. While, yes, Rorschach the comedian, Dr. Manhattan, and Ozymandias are all objectionable people, Night Owl and Silk Spectre tend to be left out of the conversation. Laurie only became the Silk Spectre because her mom essentially forced her to carry on her legacy. She never wanted to exert power over others or deal her own twisted brand of justice. She pretty much had no other choice. Her arc is about coming to terms with her situation, and even if this isn't exactly the life she had planned out, she's still gonna make the most of it and choose to move forward rather than wishing her past could have played out differently. Meanwhile, Dan's arc is about accepting his superhero identity and his desire to fight crime as a part of him. After the Keene Act forced the Watchmen to retire, Dan lives out his days alone, hiding all of his equipment and memorabilia in his basement, telling himself that he's left it all behind, but still checking in every now and then. Dan doesn't want to admit to himself that he longs for those glory days as Night Owl, because he's afraid everyone else will view him as silly. When Laurie shows genuine interest in his Night Owl persona, he's flattered and unsure exactly how to take it. He spent so long hiding from himself that he's unsure how to handle someone so bluntly accepting him for who he is. Eventually, he dons the Night Owl costume once more, and finally accepts that this is who he is, and that his life is empty without the thrill of crime fighting, and he never feels malicious about it. Dan has a genuine desire to do good. The other Night Owl was his hero, and he's hesitant about attacking civilians during the riots against the Watchmen. Dan accepts that this is truly what makes him happy, and he's not gonna run from it anymore. I think when reading Watchmen, it's important to remember the very famous quote found in graffiti and in the back of the book. Who watches the Watchmen? In universe, this represents a desire to hold those in power, the Watchmen, responsible for their actions and often excessive violence. I do think there's a double meaning to it, however. Watchmen is about deconstructing the superhero genre and studying what drives a person to want to be a superhero. What psychological state would you have to be in to run around in a mask and fight crime? In most cases, the answer isn't pretty, but I don't think Watchmen wants to strictly present the concept of the superhero as bad. If it did, then it would push further to make Dan and Laurie less likable characters, wouldn't it? That's what makes me believe the phrase, "Who watches the Watchmen?" has a double meaning. It's not just about holding superheroes accountable, it's also about asking the question of who's looking out for our heroes, who helps them in battling their inner demons, who makes sure they're okay after a big traumatic event in their life, who do they have to lean on when they're depressed, angry, or grieving? Oftentimes, they only have each other. I highly recommend anyone that hasn't already to go read Watchmen for themselves. It is a masterpiece that only exists because of the comic medium and absolutely thrives because of the medium's structure and its legacy. So how the fuck do you adapt this into a movie? Just as I struggled to find the words to describe Watchmen the comic, I struggled to find the words to describe Watchmen the movie. But god damn it, I'm going to try. Watchmen is one of the strangest comic book movies I have ever seen. It feels like it should have everything going for it, and yet it really does feel like it's just going through the motions of the comic without understanding what makes it great. The movie lifts a majority of its dialogue straight out of the comic, goes out of its way to recreate some of its panels, and yet it still feels like there's something missing. That could be due to the fact several subplots were cut out and certain scenes were trimmed or rearranged, but that just says to me Watchmen is too dense to condense into a feature-length film. I guess let me take this one complaint at a time. First off, this movie is boring to look at. The comic had its colors done by John Higgins, who painted the bleak and deathly serious world with bright and inviting primary and secondary colors that called to mind the comics of years past. Worlds that were a fantasy, where nothing ever truly goes wrong, where good always triumphs over evil. It's an aesthetic choice that runs totally in contrast to the themes of the book, and it was very clearly an intentional choice. At a glance, the world of Watchmen seems just like any other comic book, another fantasy. But take a look inside, and you'll find something much closer to our reality. In the movie, the world is much darker visually, desaturated and almost monochromatic, better matching the narrative tone, but robbing Watchmen of its unique visual identity. Second, the characters. Going back to what I said earlier, Watchmen had to condense a lot of the comic's content to fit the runtime. Because of this, the characters suffer a bit. Specifically, Rorschach, Night Owl, and Ozymandias. No disrespect to Patrick Wilson, but I just really did not feel like he captured Dan's insecurity as much as he needed to. In the comic, Dan often feels like a nervous wreck. Here, I more so get the impression that he has it all together, he's just lonely. Even his arc about accepting the thrill he gets from being Night Owl is severely underplayed. Similarly, Matthew Good captures a different kind of gravitas in his performance as Ozymandias that feels off from the original comic. In the comic, Ozymandias is full of himself and believes only he can lead humanity towards salvation, justifying it to himself by saying no one else will do what he's doing. In the movie, it's as though he feels like he's been given a mission from God. He's seen humanity's evil firsthand, and he's tried to stop it the old-fashioned way. In the movie, he's the one who tries to bring together the crime busters, not Captain Metropolis. After all those failures, it's as if he's been broken, and now he believes that this is what he has to do. It's no longer something he wants to do. Rorschach is an interesting case since his character isn't fundamentally different from how it was before, but either because of time constraints or to make his character more likable, several of his less favorable traits have been downplayed. He only steals food, like, once. His smell is only referenced once. His more right-leaning ideology is only mentioned through his monologues, and the subplot about how he completely breaks his therapist is cut out completely. Third and final thing I want to talk about, this is a very minor complaint, but the action in this movie is way more visceral than in the comic, and it just comes off as the movie trying too hard to look cool. Blood and organs splatter everywhere whenever Dr. Manhattan kills a person. A bone pokes out of someone's flesh during Dan and Laurie's fight in the alleyway. Rorschach cleaves a butcher knife through someone's brain and makes a quip about it rather than lighting their house on fire and watching in silence. It really just feels like the movie is overcompensating and trying to make itself seem more mature, which wasn't even necessary because Watchmen is already a mature story and didn't need gratuitous violence to get the point across. This isn't to say the comic has no violence. Hell, most of the minor injuries often leave long and thick trails of blood. But the movie pushes it to another level. That's pretty much all I have to say about Watchmen. Whereas Snyder's directorial style felt like it complemented 300, it feels as though it stands in opposition to Watchmen's more contemplative nature. I can go on about how the movie loses something without the minor civilian subplots, or how some scenes like Dr. Manhattan's origin didn't translate well from page to screen, but honestly, that's just a consequence of Watchmen being made as a comic book first and foremost. I know some of you probably want me to complain about some of the groan-worthy song choices in this movie, but besides Sound of Silence and the lack of You're My Thrill during the tenement rescue, I didn't mind, really, especially since music is in Watchmen's DNA. Bob Dylan was a big inspiration after all. In the end though, Watchmen the movie ends up feeling like a hollow attempt to make the story seem cooler, when it didn't need to be anything more or less than it already is. Though the opening credit scene is amazing, like genuinely, it's one of the best parts of this movie. Also, I had no idea the meme of SpongeBob screaming came from this, and I'm going insane.
Hey bro, watch your jet. Watch your jet, bro. Watch your jet!
So far, I've gone over the original adaptations for the movies I've discussed so far. But to be honest, I didn't really care going into this movie. I already have enough on my plate as is. This is why I prefaced this video saying this isn't super serious film analysis. Legend of the Guardians of the Owls of Ga'Hoole is the black sheep of Zack Snyder's filmography, being the only animated film in it. Make no mistake though, his style is all over this movie. Heavy use of slow motion, desaturated color grading, though definitely more vibrant than his previous works, even a single needle drop, with an original song in this movie by Owl City, because of course. Visually, this movie is stunning, being animated by VFX studio Animal Logic, and honestly looking better than a lot of VFX we see in modern blockbusters. Aside from that though, the movie is pretty standard. Not bad, but standard. Soren, after being kidnapped by racist owls, goes on a grand adventure to find the legendary guardians who will help him wage war on aforementioned racists. He meets a colorful cast of characters on the way who are sorely underdeveloped, and ultimately proves his bravery and courage, and also learns that war is hell, and every victory is underscored by great loss. Wait, what? That's the main thing that stood out to me here. This movie is pretty dark in its tone, only occasionally taking a moment to lighten up. Honestly, I really appreciate that. You don't see kids movies that are willing to go this hard anymore, and Zack Snyder's style perfectly complements the vibe, unlike Watchmen. Though that might have been because he had to hold back because of the movie's age rating. I can't say if this is accurate to the books though, but the movie's vibe at least feels distinct for a medium primarily dominated by unambitious movies. I don't have much else to say really. It's a perfectly serviceable time. Not bad, but not the best the medium has to offer. If you want an all-ages adventure movie that's a bit darker than the usual fare, watch Secret of NIMH or something, I don't know.
9/11, 9/11.
Sucker Punch was easily the movie I knew the least about going into this video. Hell, I had never even heard of it before. It's also the first movie on this list that's not an adaptation of any pre-existing work. Because of that, I actually had high hopes going into this movie. Most of my problems with the movie up to this point more stems from their failings as adaptations rather than Snyder's directorial style. I thought, with something more tailor-made for that style, we might have something good here. So, is Sucker Punch any good? Okay, first things first, the dream sequences are all absolute spectacles. Snyder's directorial style absolutely shines here. The choreography, the cinematography, the music, it's all great. But what does any of that matter when I don't give a shit about the characters? Basically every character here is underdeveloped. We only get the bare minimum for Baby Doll, Sweet Pea, and Rocket, and everyone else you can forget about them because they largely don't matter in the slightest. Genuinely, the only other memorable character is Oscar Isaac's character, just because he gives an amazing and scummy villain performance, and when I don't care about the characters, I'm not gonna be that invested in the set pieces they take part in. It also doesn't help that these action sequences aren't actually happening, and like, that doesn't have to be a negative. I think these dream sequences could have been an interesting opportunity to use these insane over-the-top action set pieces to say something interesting about these characters, a metaphorical representation of these characters facing their own inner struggles. Instead, the only narrative purpose they serve is to just vaguely correlate to what's happening in the real world. I mean, yeah, Baby Doll copes with what's happening to her through escapism and tries to make the situation more pleasant for herself, but the movie never makes any statement about this trait of hers beyond just being there. Baby Doll doesn't learn any lessons about facing her fears head on or even using her escapist fantasies to confront some other aspect of herself. She just does it because that's her character, because that's what gives them an excuse to have all these crazy set pieces. I suppose the ending where she distracts the crowd while Sweet Pea escapes is meant to be her facing reality, but it's not built up in any meaningful way. It just sorta happens. I don't think every movie needs to have some profound or poignant statement about the characters or about the world, but this movie definitely would have benefited from something more than the tacked on message at the end that only we can control our own destiny or some shit. This movie isn't terrible, but it's definitely my least favorite movie so far. It's the only one that I was actively bored during. Sucker Punch comes off as a hollow blockbuster that feels like it came from the mind of a writer who just wanted to see how cool they could make something, without ever stopping to think if what they were creating was interesting. If you're in the mood for a fun and campy action romp you don't really have to think about that deeply, then you'll have a fun time with this. For me though, even as a camp enjoyer, the movie lacked the heart to really make me enjoy it to the fullest. So, what have we learned so far about what Zack Snyder's directorial style looks like? I mean, that was the point of this video, wasn't it? Well, so far, here's what I picked up on. We got muted color palettes, hilariously literal choices for songs, i.e. Down with the Sickness and Dawn of the Dead, over-the-top action sequences, the use of slow motion to enhance the dramatic weight of a scene. That's about it. We'll see how much more of this ends up being relevant to any of these other movies. "2013's Man of Steel is an important entry in this list. It was Superman's first movie in 7 years after the middling reception of Superman Returns, and it would become the basis for which DC would try and fail to launch their own cinematic universe with the DCEU. Even before that was the plan though, I remember excitement being high for this project, at least that's how it felt to me at the time. I actually came very close to watching this movie with my whole family when it was new, but it was midnight, I was tired, so I got driven home while they went off to watch this movie. I always wondered if I really missed out on anything by not seeing this movie, especially since the film's reception isn't much better than its predecessor. Now that I finally sat down and watched it, what do I think? It is very not good. Okay, I need to make this clear before I go into my thoughts on this movie. I was never a huge DC fan growing up. I basically liked Batman, and that was it. I gravitated more towards Marvel when I was younger. This is basically my way of saying I can't really judge this movie from the perspective of a huge Superman fan. I have enough familiarity with the character to generally get an idea of how this film molds the source material into its own, but full disclosure, I am not the man whose opinion on this movie you should be taking seriously. So with that out of the way, here's my opinion on this movie. This movie is really strange for me to talk about. While watching it, I didn't hate it. I mean, I even liked some parts of it, but overall, I just found it inoffensive and forgettable. The more I thought about the movie though, the more I realized, wow, this sucks. I imagine if I was more invested in Superman as a property, I would have a much more visceral reaction. Even as a non-fan though, there's one specific aspect of the movie I find difficult to reconcile, and I imagine most other people do as well. Let's talk about Jonathan Kent. So Jonathan Kent is a good dad. I get where he's coming from. If I were in that situation, I would probably also want to protect my son from the outside world. Only God knows what would happen if they were discovered. The problem is that this is fucking Superman. A big part of his character is how his parents drilled his strict morals into him. They're the ones who taught him to see the best in people, that he can help humanity. Instead, they discourage him from interacting with other people and tell him he should be worried about what might happen if he's discovered. This, coupled with the bullying Clark goes through as a child, means he doesn't really have a believable reason to want to help people. Of course, it's always a part of Clark's nature to want to help people, but nothing about the way he was nurtured in this adaptation makes me believe he wouldn't just stay hidden or choose to look the other way. And this all culminates in John's sacrifice, where he actively discourages his son from saving him from a tornado, which is fucking stupid. From my understanding, traditionally, John dies of a heart attack, and it's supposed to be Clark's lesson that he can't save everyone as much as he wants to. What does John's death in Man of Steel teach Clark? That he should fear humanity? That he should fear the power he wields? I honestly don't fucking know. And I'm not sure if the film knows either. Throughout the entire movie, people pressure Clark into taking a position on whether he's going to side with humanity or whether he's going to side with Krypton. But I don't see any reason why he would side with humanity other than that the plot demands it. The only super formative experience I can think of for Clark that the movie shows that might have influenced his desire to help people is when Pete Ross helps him off the ground after he gets hassled by some bullies, when previously Pete bullied Clark before he saved his life. And it's such a small moment spent with a character who doesn't do that much that I doubt most audience members would pay it any mind. The entire movie is Clark telling people that he's pro-humanity, but then he doesn't really go out of his way to save anyone or ensure their safety during his fights in Smallville and Metropolis, basically only going out of his way to save characters that are important to him specifically. He does willingly give himself up to Zod at first, and of course we have his miscellaneous acts of heroism before going public, but that's all expected. There's nothing like him getting a cow out of a tree or helping people with manual labor just cause he wants to. Any sort of small act of kindness that doesn't immediately involve someone else's protection would have gone a long way to showcasing Clark's humanity. But even if you're willing to look past all of that, what does Man of Steel have to offer? I don't necessarily need Man of Steel to be a one-to-one reflection of comic book Superman. What makes it stand out compared to other Superman adaptations? Well, it's probably the most boring one. Snyder's directorial style barely shines through here. We got some muted colors, some cool cinematography, and action sequences are visually stunning, but otherwise, only one use of licensed music, no use of slow motion. Hell, the actual fighting sort of feels weightless a lot of the time with how much people are flying through buildings and how little attention is put on how terrifying of a situation this is after Superman arrives. With how harrowing the scenes of people escaping the World Engine are, I expected to see a big emphasis on Clark going out of his way to save people and bring them hope, but nah, we gotta move on to fighting Zod. The almost comically over-the-top action in 300, Watchmen, or even Sucker Punch just is not there. Okay, well, what ideas does Man of Steel have to differentiate itself from the source material? Well, the setup to Superman going public is at least unique. He's this hitchhiker who's constantly traveling around and changing identities because he always ends up blowing his cover in one way or another because he can't restrain his nature to help people. Okay, that sounds interesting. What does this movie do with it? Well, we get the oil rig scene in the beginning. Clark ends up leaving town after destroying a guy's truck. And then jump cut to him in Antarctica doing some job where he meets Lois Lane and discovers the alien ship. Okay, I would have liked to see more of that, but that's fine, I guess. Okay, well, throughout the movie, characters like John, Jor-El, and Zod are hyping up this idea that Clark will essentially be a god to humanity, that if the people of Earth learn of his existence, it will change the status quo forever. We even get little glimpses of how the public might react to him during the montage of Lois tracking down where he came from, where he's spoken of like some urban legend or ghost story. How will the public react when they find out a being so powerful lives among them? Well, gee, I don't know. Whatever reaction they might have had clearly isn't fucking important enough to ever fucking show us. Literally all we get from this plot point is seeing how the world comes to a standstill when Zod makes his presence known, and how the military is eager to get Clark off this planet, which is barely anything. I thought for sure the scene where Clark goes to church would have been to highlight how his presence and the presence of alien life may shatter the beliefs of some religious folk. But no, by the end of the movie, it feels like the status quo hasn't changed much. It's just business as usual at the Daily Planet and seemingly everywhere else. Okay, well, what about the Codex? We learn it contains the genetic information for every Kryptonian to be born, and now all that information is stored inside Clark. Now it's not just about stopping fringe Kryptonian warlords from taking over Earth. Clark literally has the weight of his entire species on his shoulders. How is he going to make a decision on whether he should save humanity or bring back the Kryptonians? Could he potentially do both even? I don't know. Could this never even a question for Clark? Of course he's gonna side with humanity. I don't even think he ever finds out he has the Codex inside of him. Ugh. Okay, I really wanted to give the new ideas in this film a chance, but they really are more interesting than they are satisfying. Man of Steel is the world of Superman with all the life and color sucked out of it with nothing to substitute it. Again, if I was a bigger fan, I would probably be more upset than I already am, but instead, I just found this movie rather boring. And to me, being boring is the absolute worst thing your movie can be. It's a shame because the opening origin story is pretty good. In the very little time we spend in Krypton, it feels like an actual place that I would want to spend more time in. It's a shame because the idea of Superman essentially being a god to humanity when he just wants to be a part of them could be an interesting idea to tackle. It's a shame because Henry Cavill is great casting for this character, but it feels like his talent was wasted. Man of Steel is not a bad movie, but I certainly would not call it a good one. It's an average Hollywood blockbuster using a legacy IP to drive ticket sales, and if even someone who only has a baseline familiarity with the original source material can recognize its faults as an adaptation, then that's not a good sign.
Bruce, it's been 5 years. You still owe me $16. Fuck off.
2016's Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice is one of the few movies on this list I've seen before. I think I liked it for the most part, but to be honest, I don't remember much from when I first watched this, so I'm just gonna skip the preamble and jump into my thoughts. Okay, let's get this out of the way first. The opening of this movie is incredible. Yes, we have the Batman origin story again, but it's condensed into a dramatic and beautifully shot opening credit sequence. We also have Bruce's POV during the final battle of Man of Steel, which already is addressing my biggest problem about Man of Steel. By the end of that movie, it feels like the world hasn't changed at all, despite the fact that everyone is telling Clark his presence will shift the status quo forever. Whether this was due to time or a lack of desire to show this, I don't know, but already this movie does more to address the fallout of that battle with Zod than Man of Steel ever did. In fact, that's basically the plot of the whole movie. The entire world fears Superman and what his presence means for them. Does a man with that much power have the right to exercise it in the way he's doing? Is he even a man? We see so many people treat him as a hero, as a god, but we see just as many people who view him as a threat to life on Earth as we know it. Ultimately, it becomes too much for Clark. He starts to doubt himself and whether he even should help humanity. Why go out of his way to help a people who hate and fear him? Ultimately, however, he chooses to go back out there and save the day, because even if the world rejects him, he knows there's at least one person who still believes in him, who will always believe in him. The one he loves, his world, Lois Lane. I mean, it's not particularly subtle, but I applaud the fact that they built off the foundation of Man of Steel when they could have easily ignored it. Man of Steel walked so this movie could run. There, I said it. Okay, I wish I could end the discussion there, but unfortunately we have to talk about everything else. Because Superman is only one half of this movie. Or 1/3, I guess. Let's talk about Batman. This movie presents a version of Batman that has been completely broken. We get allusions to his past battles with previous villains, and of course, the infamous Robin suit in the Batcave, presumably from Jason Todd. He's been through a lot, and has become more brutal because of his experiences. Let's just address the elephant in the room. This Batman is straight up a murderer. Of course there's the warehouse fight where he absolutely decimates a group of people, but we also see the Bat brand, yes that's what I'm calling it, that he uses on people to essentially mark them for death. I'm mixed on this. On one hand, I can absolutely see why this version of Batman has been driven to this point, but I also understand for many, this is completely out of character for him. You could argue that it seems Tim Drake does not exist in this universe, so he never had another Robin to keep him in check, and thus he just kind of became a lunatic, but like, it's still an odd thing to do to a character who is typically vehemently against killing. Really, it just seems like an excuse to make Batman seem cooler, without any thought put into what it says about him as a person. It's a shame, because I totally get why he would want to fight Superman. He's just as fearful as everyone else of his power. Because at the end of the day, Bruce Wayne is still a man. Would a more comic accurate Batman kill Superman though? Probably not. Hell, maybe that's why they made the change to his character, just to get a fight going. And the fact he hesitates in killing him when he says Martha and spares him when he finds out he has a mother just muddies his character even more. Like, why didn't he just kill him? What difference does Clark having a mother in danger make to Bruce? He's clearly shown no problems with killing people before. I suppose it's because she's an innocent civilian, but then wouldn't Bruce just want to go right back to fighting? Apparently not, because he's just suddenly chill with Clark now, I guess. While I'm here, I might as well mention, I have no idea why Superman would distrust Batman. Like, his dislike of him isn't even what drives their fight at the end, so why they set up Clark's disapproval of Batman at all is a mystery to me. Maybe he doesn't approve of his violent methods, but like, Clark hasn't really shown any problem with murder either. Like, he definitely killed that one terrorist guy in the beginning, right? I suppose there's the ending of Man of Steel, but like, that never gets addressed again. And then of course we have our third pillar of this movie, Lex Luthor. I can very much see how a comic fan would hate this interpretation of Luthor, but honestly, I kinda dig it. They drop absolutely all pretense of him being calm and suave. Instead, he's just a fucking weirdo. Like, he's just an absolute gremlin, constantly spouting nonsense to sound smart, and coming across as really creepy and sinister. It's great. Bro literally gave a jar of piss to a senator. He's that petty. I wish I could say his plan came together though, as by the end of the third act, it and the rest of the movie sort of fall apart when it just becomes a big CGI monster battle. Like, okay, yeah, I get you want to make these two fight, but then why create Doomsday? Sure, he can be a backup plan, but he was gonna wake up regardless of whether Clark won or not. If you don't want a god running around, then what was your goal in creating the devil to counter him? Did he know Clark would sacrifice himself and both of them would die? I highly doubt it. And this is where Batman v Superman falls apart. When two of its three story pillars don't really work, then it's not a movie I can confidently call good. It's a shame because I enjoyed this way more than Man of Steel. The action's a huge step up and feels more weighty, the cinematography is more interesting, and it followed up on Man of Steel's ideas in interesting ways, but none of its own ideas are great. I'm not even going to talk about Wonder Woman in detail since she basically had no reason to be here. Like, you could take her out of the movie and it wouldn't really change anything. As adorable as Lois and Clark's relationship is in this movie, Lois still doesn't feel like a super well-defined character beyond being a persistent journalist with a strong moral code. And of course, there's the fact this movie kills Jimmy Olsen in the first act, but it's really just a character that just so happens to share a name with a comic character, and not that character. It honestly just feels like an Easter egg they threw in there with little thought about how it affects the universe or how fans would react. It's sort of an interesting microcosm of the movie itself. Something they threw in with little thought about whether it made sense. In my heart, Batman v Superman is far away a better movie than Man of Steel, but really, it's not that much better. Also, they butchered the design of my boy Doomsday, good lord. So I'm sure a lot of you are asking right now, why are you talking about this movie? Just talk about the Snyder Cut. Justice League might as well not even be a movie directed by Zack Snyder. To which I say, well, yeah, you have a point. Justice League is a weird case for this list, as while yes, Zack Snyder was the director attached to the project, he would ultimately end up stepping down with directorial duties being passed to Joss Whedon. The resulting film would be very different in tone and style to the previous films in the DCEU. Now, of course, we all know by now the original 4-hour rough cut of this movie before Whedon stepped in would be completed and re-released as Zack Snyder's Justice League. But if you've seen it, you know it's different enough to essentially be a completely different movie. This isn't an ultimate cut situation like with Batman v Superman or even Watchmen, where they're mostly the same movie, so I didn't find them worth bringing up. Both Justice League movies might as well be different films with the same overall plot. So why am I even talking about the theatrical cut of Justice League? Because Zack Snyder still technically has directorial credits on the film, and I clearly haven't suffered enough. Before we talk about the Snyder cut, I'm gonna talk about Justice League as it was released in 2017 and judge it as its own movie before I compare it to what came later. Justice League, or Justice League as it's sometimes referred to, is a movie. That's it, that's the end of the sentence. I'm truly struggling to find anything to say about this movie, but I guess I'll try. Justice League attempts to course correct some of the decisions fans were less receptive towards from previous movies. Superman is nowhere near as brooding, goes out of his way to save people. He actually feels like a proper symbol of hope now. Batman is way less bloodthirsty, but no less determined to do good. That's all fine and good, I guess, but this ends up resulting in this movie feeling incredibly disconnected from what came before it. Before Superman is revived, everyone speaks about him with reverence, like mankind has never truly been the same without him, like the world lost a piece of its soul that fateful day he fell. Okay, that would be cool if that were true, because let's not forget half the world also fucking hated Clark's guts and thought he had the potential to become a killing machine. In the 18 months Superman was active, He wasn't a universally loved figure. That was the whole point. Okay, I can't keep ignoring this talking point forever. We have to talk about the big problem with the entire DCEU, and that's how rushed it all was. We only got to know Clark for 2 movies before he died, which could have been fine if he started to get more in touch with his humanity, but he was largely sacrificing himself for the people he loves rather than people as a whole. Plus, Justice League is given the tall order of having to introduce us to 3 new main characters with The Flash, Aquaman, and Cyborg. As a result, none of them feel fleshed out beyond their basic personalities. The Flash is silly and naive, Aquaman is a bro and a bit confrontational, and Cyborg is brooding and unsure of himself. I hope none of them were your favorite characters from the comics, cause they're just kinda here. And of course, Batman never even got his solo movie before being thrust into all of this. I'm gonna be honest, I don't have the energy to talk about this movie in detail any further. I genuinely don't know how I can even do that. Steppenwolf is a boring and uninteresting villain, the mother boxes are poorly explained, the trademark Joss Whedon humor is pretty hit and miss, the green screening and color grading is pretty iffy, the absurdity of Henry Cavill's digitally removed mustache. There's just nothing more I can say about any of those things beyond what I've said already. At least with the last few movies, I've had a good amount of interesting talking points regarding their failings, but I really got nothing here. And this isn't me saying the movie is good, this is me saying the movie is unremarkable, it's boring, it's standard, it's average, whatever other words I could use to describe it. I'm just ready to move on.
Hey, yo, the pizza here. Oh, nigga!
My ears burn.
Here we are, folks. The big one. The one people clamored for years until it was finally released when Warner Brothers realized they needed to give people a reason to buy HBO Max. Zack Snyder's Justice League, or just the Snyder Cut as I'll be referring to it. I'm writing this part of the video before I sit down and watch it again, as this is the final film out of this lineup that I have seen before. I think it's important to remember that Justice League was always fighting an uphill battle. I think regardless of whether the theatrical cut stayed true to Snyder's style, there's no way it would have been 4 hours, and likely would have faced all the same issues as the theatrical release of the film, minus the hit and miss humor. That's why I find the decision to not trim down the rough cut and keep it at 4 hours interesting. Like, this is either going to be the most boring and bloated movie ever, or maybe this movie will have something going for it. I suppose I won't know till I watch it. Or well, I technically already have watched it, because even though I'm writing this before, I record when I've already seen it. Whatever, just don't worry about it, okay? Anyways, it's a fucking miracle this movie is actually good. The 3 characters that absolutely needed more screen time got what they needed to actually make me care about them. Victor, Arthur, and Steppenwolf? Actually, yeah, Steppenwolf is way more interesting in this movie. We'll get to him later. But let's talk about Barry. Barry got the least amount of new material to work with, but he's still pretty endearing. The new scene with him applying for a job at a pet store and his time travel shenanigans do a lot of heavy lifting. He still doesn't have a crazy arc, but it's just nice to have more of him. And every other character has definitely gotten a major glow up. I actually care about them now. Arthur is way more than just dude bro fish guy now. He's a man trapped between 2 worlds, belonging to both of them, and yet not feeling at home in either. He rejects Bruce's initial call to action to join the Justice League because, well, he thinks he's full of shit. But when trouble comes knocking, he's ready to work together for the greater good, and ends up finding that place where he feels like he belongs, even if he often disagrees with the group. Victor had the most substantial improvement out of everyone here. He's arguably the most important character in the story. His tie to the Mother Box's power gives him the strength he needs to stop the Unity. We also get way more drama between him and his dad now. Yeah, the way Silas dies is really stupid, but I honestly didn't mind that much when I was so compelled by Victor's struggles. He so clearly wants to hate his father for turning him into a machine, for never being there when he needed him most. But he can't bring himself to do so. If anything, Victor is more angry with himself. He can only view himself as a machine rather than a man. He feels like it's his fault that his dad never paid him any mind until his life was at stake. But ultimately, he comes to accept that he can make the most out of his condition and help other people. He comes to realize his own worth. He comes to realize he was never broken. Hell, even Steppenwolf is a way better character now. He's way more intimidating and isn't constantly getting undercut by being the butt of jokes. He comes off as a sufficiently scary threat that we should be worried about, and it makes the way he kneels to Darkseid all the more worrying. If even this guy has someone he bows to, then how can our heroes ever hope to beat them? Unfortunately, this mainly acts as setup for a movie that we all knew would never come, but it's at least compelling setup. I think the only character I'm disappointed didn't get to be more fleshed out is Lois. She's roughly at the same level of complexity she was in the theatrical cut, minus the fact she might be pregnant, I think? It's very subtly implied and easy to miss. Other than that though, she's largely just the weeping widow in this movie. Honestly, her character just gets worse every movie, especially as they try to build towards their Injustice storyline. It starts to feel like she's more just a plot device than anything. This is made the most apparent during the scene with Lois and Martha, where at the last minute, Martha is revealed to actually be Martian Manhunter, which turns a genuinely heartfelt and emotional moment into more sequel baiting. It's unfortunate, really. Back to positives. If nothing else, it was super refreshing to see how they were willing to fully unchain Zack Snyder's style for the first time since Sucker Punch. Though nowhere near as over the top as that movie, of course. Visually stunning action sequences with slow-mo, some hilariously literal needle drops, a healthy dose of blood and guts that doesn't feel overbearing. It's so refreshing after the last few movies where it feels like they were almost ashamed of having Snyder's stamp on the movie. Honestly though, I think the Snyder Cut's greatest strength is how it sorta drops its attempts at making any sort of meaningful commentary like what Man of Steel and Batman v Superman tried and failed to do. Yeah, Superman is still our messiah figure, but the film doesn't call nearly as much attention to it as the previous films. Before, where it felt like interesting theming that tries to trick you into thinking it's meaningful commentary, here, it's just an interesting visual, which is honestly fine. I'm just blown away at how competent this movie is, and there's no way it would have turned out this way if it was released theatrically, because it would have been trimmed down. It would have had the violence toned down. And for sure, Snyder's directorial style would have been sanded down to where it was barely noticeable. Yeah, this movie isn't perfect. Yeah, it's not high art or anything. But like, it's pretty damn good for what it is. And that's more than enough for me.
Helicopter, helicopter!
And now for our final film, Army of the Dead. A sort of spiritual successor to Snyder's first film. Unlike Dawn of the Dead 2004, however, Army of the Dead is not an adaptation of any of George Romero's other directed zombie movies, which I think was ultimately for the best. My main issue with Dawn of the Dead 2004 is how it just felt like a less focused version of the original. But Snyder choosing to write the story himself, along with Shay Haddon and Joby Harold, means the film can potentially avoid unfavorable comparisons as an adaptation, and just be critiqued as its own thing. One thing that immediately caught my eye was that Snyder actually did the cinematography himself for this movie. In most of Snyder's previous films, this job was given to Larry Fong, who certainly did a lot in establishing Snyder's directorial style with the way he captures even the most mundane activities as if they're the most important thing you'll see all year. Snyder does a pretty good job at filling in for Fong, and he still gets a small cameo, so yeah. I'd say Army of the Dead was a nice throwback to Snyder's earlier films. Just a good old, dumb, fun action movie that thankfully isn't trying to seem super deep like the previous DC films. The writing is pretty alright, but unfortunately, the characters are not. Despite pushing a 2.5-hour runtime, Scott and Kate are basically the only interesting characters here, and even then, their stories aren't all that original. Still, I think their storyline is executed well enough that I got invested, and even teared up a bit at the ending. Dieter is also great. He's just such a lovable dork who gets all excited and cocky one minute and very quickly gets brought down to earth and goes back to being a shy, nervous wreck. While the movie's characters aren't that special, I still cared about them way more than I did anyone in the Dawn of the Dead 2004 cast. The way this film portrays the zombies is also pretty interesting. I'm not too familiar with zombie movies, so the only comparison I can think of is like I Am Legend in its alternate ending. They're a bit more sentient, or at least some of them are. The alphas are at least intelligent enough to be able to communicate and feel some kind of sorrow, particularly when the queen is killed. The film never really dwells on it too much, and Honestly, they're still more animalistic than anything. So it's just to add some tension more than anything. These things are scarier when they have personal grudges. Honestly, I don't have much else to say about Army of the Dead. It's just kind of a fun action movie with Snyder's signature directorial style. Great action, hilarious needle drops, some slow motion. The only thing it's missing is the more muted color palette, but honestly, I found its absence so refreshing. This film is way more vibrant than previous films Snyder directed, and it makes his cinematography way more interesting to look at. If you want a nice and gory zombie popcorn flick with a heist movie twist, definitely check this one out. And so, we have reached the end of our journey. What did we learn from this experience? Not much, to be honest. I don't know why I did this to myself, but hey, at least I enjoyed some of these. I guess if there's one takeaway I have from all of this, is that, though you may not notice it at first, almost every director has their quirks. After watching enough of their stuff, you will start to notice it. I do want to make one thing clear though, because yes, directors do have styles that can greatly affect a product, but they are not the sole authors of their films. Throughout this video, I tried to avoid calling these movies Zack Snyder's movies, because while yes, he did direct them and had a large influence on why these films turned out the way they did, to say these are his movies would be devaluing the work every other crew member put into these movies. All the actors, writers, cinematographers, editors, composers, sound designers, animators, costume designers, set designers, makeup artists, and so many more. None of these films would have been possible without them. Cinema is a group effort, and that should be celebrated more. Alright, enough ham-fisted messaging, let's rank these movies. Number 10, Justice League. This movie barely counts for this marathon as is. Number 9, Man of Steel. Fuck this movie. Number 8, Sucker Punch. Fuck this movie too, but at least it's more visually interesting. Number 7, Legend of the Guardians. It's got great vibes. Batman v Superman. I had more fun with this than I would like to admit. Number 5, Watchmen, a misguided comic book adaptation. Number 4, Dawn of the Dead, a zombie thriller that would be nail-biting if the characters are better. Number 3, 300, a pretty good comic book adaptation actually. Number 2, Army of the Dead, a super fun zombie thriller that's got at least 2 strong characters, which gives it a leg up. Number 1, the Snyder Cut, a miracle that it even exists, let alone is actually good. Alright, I don't know how else to end this video. Bye.